Have you ever felt that an image transports you to another time, to an emotion so intense that it forces you to stop, breathe, and contemplate? Such is the case with Sadak in Search of the Waters of Oblivion, one of the most striking paintings of British Romanticism. It was created in the year 1812 by John Martin, a painter born in Northumberland, who would become one of the most fascinating and visionary figures of the 19th century. Martin was not just any artist, he was a dreamer of impossible landscapes, an architect of chaos, and a narrator of apocalyptic visions. From his youth, while painting on glass and ceramics, he understood that art could be more than decoration. It could be a way to reveal the eternal struggle of human beings against nature, power, and destiny. In Sadak in Search of the Waters of Oblivion, Martin captured all of this in a single scene, one that still disturbs and amazes those who behold it today. The title already announces a mythical journey of the spirit. The work is inspired by a story contained in the Tales of the Genii, published in 1764 by James Ridley under the pseudonym Sir Charles Morel. Ridley pretended it was a translation of an ancient Persian manuscript, but in reality it was his own literary invention, an Orientalist tale that embodied the dreams and fears of the Western world. In that story, Sadak, a Persian nobleman, is forced by Sultan Amurath to embark on an almost impossible journey. He must find the Waters of Oblivion, a magical liquid capable of erasing memory. Only if he brings back a sample will he recover his wife, Kalisrad, who was kidnapped by the tyrant. What follows is an odyssey filled with symbols. Sadak crosses deserts, faces demons, climbs impossible heights, and endures trials that challenge both his body and soul. John Martin chose to depict the decisive moment, that instant in which the hero, on the edge of the abyss, clings to the rock to ascend toward the unknown. The painting is a visual avalanche. The man appears tiny, almost lost among red mountains, raging waterfalls, and formations that seem forged by the wrath of the gods. That disproportion is no accident. It is the essence of Romanticism. Martin wanted to remind the viewer that, before the immensity of the universe, we are small, vulnerable, and yet capable of immense courage. The composition is dominated by diagonals that guide the eye from the figure of Sadak, at the lower right, toward the beam of light breaking through the sky. It is a fractured light, like a distant hope. The reddish and orange tones merge with deep shadows, creating a landscape that seems to burn from within. There is no serenity here. Everything vibrates with the tension of movement, ascent, and sacrifice. Technically, the work is an oil on canvas, but more than a painting, it resembles contained fire. Martin's brushwork is meticulous, almost obsessive. Every rock, every crack, every reflection of water was rendered with scientific precision. Martin was interested in geology and natural phenomena, and that scientific curiosity intertwines here with his apocalyptic imagination. The mountain becomes a double symbol. On one hand, it is the obstacle separating the hero from his goal. On the other, it is the test of his inner transformation. The Water of Oblivion, which gives the painting its title, is also a powerful metaphor. It represents the loss of memory, the renunciation of the past, the temptation to erase pain. But at the same time, it can be interpreted as the desire to begin again, to be reborn without the chains of remembrance. In this sense, Sadak is not only climbing a mountain, he is climbing his own mind. He seeks something that could either destroy him or set him free. Without showing other characters, Martin makes the viewer feel this inner struggle. Each stone seems like a thought, each waterfall, a torrent of emotions threatening to drag him down. The viewer does not see only a solitary hero, but also themselves reflected in that tiny figure, fighting against forces greater than their will. Early 19th century English Romanticism was fascinated by the concept of the sublime, that which combines beauty and terror, that which overwhelms to the point of erasing the ego. Sadak, in Search of the Waters of Oblivion, is a perfect example of that ideal. Martin did not seek to represent nature as something gentle or pastoral, but as an unleashed, immense, almost divine force. In comparison, humanity is an ephemeral spark, but within that spark lies the fire of defiance, the will to survive. When the painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1812, Martin was still a young artist dreaming of recognition. It is said that he was so nervous during the installation that he nearly panicked when the workers could not tell which side of the painting was up. He feared his work would be ridiculed, but the reaction was different. The public was fascinated. There was something in that image unlike anything they had ever seen. It was a vision that combined literature, science, emotion, and faith. One spectator wrote that it looked like a scene seen by a fallen angel looking back toward the earth. The painting was sold for 50 guineas to banker William Manning, and with that sale Martin secured the beginning of his career. However, not all critics were generous. Some considered his style theatrical or excessive. Years later, John Ruskin would accuse him of using grandiosity as a substitute for truth. But those criticisms did little to dull the fascination his work provoked. Martin became a pioneer of visual epic, a precursor of fantastic art and modern spectacle. His mastery of color and light would later inspire illustrators, filmmakers, and set designers. In fact, many modern critics regard him as an early influence on apocalyptic cinema, since his paintings resemble frames from a cosmic film. Over time, the painting disappeared from public view. For decades, only a smaller version preserved at the Southampton City Art Gallery was known. The original, larger and more majestic, was rediscovered in Sweden and acquired by the St. Louis Art Museum in 1983, where it remains today. There are no records of controversial restorations or severe damage, though it has been carefully preserved due to the fragility of the red pigments and the aging of the canvas. As for hidden symbolism, some modern researchers have proposed deeper interpretations. They see Sadak's journey as a critique of power that manipulates memory and controls human will. The Sultan who demands the Water of Oblivion can represent the authority that wants to erase history, while Sadak embodies resistance, the stubborn will to remember, to not renounce identity. Other scholars highlight the alchemical nature of the tale, the Water of Oblivion as a metaphor for the dissolution of the ego, a necessary step towards spiritual rebirth. From that perspective, the painting becomes an allegory of the soul's inner process of purification. The work also hides powerful Christian symbolism disguised as an Oriental myth. Sadak's ascent recalls Mount Calvary, redemptive sacrifice, the climb toward light. The waterfall, meanwhile, can be read as an inverted baptism, a threat of annihilation before salvation. In Romanticism, this fusion of faith, myth, and science was common, and Martin managed to turn it into pure image. There are no records of scandals or taboos directly linked to the painting, but there is a curious story about its popular reception. At the time, some believed Martin had painted a vision of hell. Others thought it represented an unknown planet. His overwhelming style seemed to defy the boundaries between religious and landscape art. That ambiguity was precisely what made it unforgettable. The painting measures approximately 183 by 131 centimeters, and when seen in person, one understands why it caused such an impact. It is not just its size that impresses, but also the sense of depth, the illusion of movement, and the enveloping atmosphere. At the St. Louis Art Museum, the painting is exhibited with directed lighting to emphasize the contrast between infernal shadows and the upper glow. The viewer feels trapped between both worlds, as if climbing alongside the protagonist. Through Sadak in Search of the Waters of Oblivion, John Martin consolidated his language, colossal landscapes, tiny figures, cosmic drama. From there he would go on to paint biblical scenes of destruction, such as the great day of his wrath or the Last Judgment, that would make him a legend of apocalyptic art. But it all began here, with this lone man climbing toward nothing and toward everything. Today the work can be interpreted in many ways. It is, on one hand, a testimony to the human power of persistence, even when the goal seems unattainable. On the other, it is a warning about the temptation to forget, to erase what defines us. It can also be read as a modern metaphor for the scientific and exploratory spirit, the impulse to conquer the unknown even at the cost of life itself. In a world constantly seeking new ways to anesthetize the mind and forget, Sadak's story acquires an unexpected resonance. Martin, unknowingly, painted an image that transcends myth and becomes universal. His hero is not a warrior or a king, but a human being confronting his own smallness. His landscape is not merely a mountain, but a mirror of the soul, and his light is not only divine illumination, but the inner spark that pushes us to keep climbing, even when the path seems impossible. At its core, Sadak in Search of the Waters of Oblivion is a reflection on the price of consciousness. To reach wisdom, one might have to face oblivion. To remember who we are, we may have to lose everything. The painting offers no answers, only questions. And that is precisely its power. It forces us to look within, to question what we are truly seeking when we chase our own waters of oblivion. More than 2 centuries later, the work remains alive because it contains an eternal dilemma. We are all, at some point, Sadak. We climb among ruins, we carry guilt, we search for a light to guide us out of the abyss. John Martin, with his brush and prophetic vision, left us a silent reminder: true greatness lies not in conquering nature, but in daring to face it. And in that gesture, in that step on the rock toward the unknown, humanity reveals itself as more than a shadow among mountains. It reveals itself as a spark of eternity. In the years following the creation of Sadak in Search of the Waters of Oblivion, John Martin became a figure both admired and controversial. His ability to combine technical mastery with emotion placed him somewhere between science and revelation, between the engineering of landscape and prophetic vision. What some saw as theatrical exaggeration, others regarded as proof that art could speak of the infinite. His style opened a path for a new visual sensibility: the monumental, the catastrophic, the divine. Martin himself declared that he wanted to paint as if the universe itself breathed within the canvas. In Sadak, that intention can be felt at first glance. There is not a single superfluous element. Every stroke points toward the vertigo of existence and the will to rise above despair. During the 19th century, his work was reproduced in engravings, lithographs, and illustrated publications that brought it to audiences throughout Europe. Sadak became an emblematic image of visual romanticism, a required reference for those exploring the relationship between art, myth, and emotion. What is fascinating is that, unlike other painters of his time who glorified history or religion, Martin placed the common individual at the center of the cataclysm. His hero is neither saint nor god. He is a solitary man facing the impossible. That humanization of suffering and perseverance is what connected with viewers then, and what still moves us today. As his career progressed, Martin expanded his subjects toward biblical visions of the end of the world: cities destroyed by fire, oceans devouring civilizations, skies opening to reveal the final judgment. Yet Sadak remained the seed of all that universe. The first time the painter dared to measure the human soul against the immensity of the cosmos. In that sense, Sadak in Search of the Waters of Oblivion is not a landscape painting, but a painting of consciousness. Every rock, every cloud, every lightning bolt seems to be a thought of the universe contemplating its own creation. In modern studies of romantic art, much has been said about the sublime man, that tiny being who faces immensity, and in doing so discovers his own inner divinity. Sadak embodies that idea. His journey toward the waters of oblivion can be understood as an allegory of self-knowledge. He does not seek material reward, but the power to be reborn free from the chains of the past. In psychological terms, it is the soul's journey through shadow, the descent into the unconscious, followed by the ascent purified. Martin does not explain it in words, but his brush shouts it with every stroke. There is no elevation without sacrifice, no memory without oblivion. Over time, the painting began to acquire new interpretations. Some 20th century critics linked it to the fears and desires of the Industrial Revolution. The monumental rocks and overflowing torrents could be seen as metaphors for the energy transforming the world. Steam, coal, the forces of nature harnessed by man. Sadak, in that context, would represent the modern human, small before his own power, lost among the very advances he has created. Others, more contemporary, have seen in it an ecological critique ahead of its time, a reminder of how fragile our existence is before the landscape we seek to dominate. Today, when the work is viewed at the St. Louis Art Museum, visitors often fall silent. There is something in that tiny figure that provokes an intimate connection, as if each spectator recognized their own effort reflected in it. The golden light filtering from the sky seems to promise that every ascent is worth it, even when the path becomes unbearable. Perhaps that is why the painting continues to be studied, not only by art historians but also by philosophers and psychologists. It represents the perfect union between visual metaphor and human experience. Technically, the restorations the painting has undergone at the museum have been minimal and very respectful. The original varnish, which had yellowed over the years, was cleaned to restore its luminosity and chromatic depth. Specialists discovered that Martin used red iron oxide pigments mixed with natural lacquers to achieve that almost volcanic glow. He also applied successive glazes to create the sensation of movement and atmosphere, a technique that distinguishes him from his contemporaries. The meticulousness with which he built each texture reveals not only technical mastery but also spiritual intent. He wanted the viewer to feel the weight of the rock, the cold of the wind, the vertigo of the abyss. The final message of Sadak, In Search of the Waters of Oblivion, seems to transcend its time. It speaks to us of faith, sacrifice, and the endless quest. In an age obsessed with speed and forgetfulness, the painting reminds us of the need to pause, look upward, and acknowledge what it costs to keep climbing. Martin painted an exhausted body, but also an unbreakable will. It is the visual representation of hope in its purest form, one that does not promise immediate reward, but the dignity of continuing forward despite fatigue. Many later artists, from 19th century symbolists to 20th century science fiction filmmakers, have acknowledged Martin's influence. His way of portraying human smallness before infinity anticipated the great apocalyptic scenes of modern cinema, from Metropolis to Blade Runner. Even some contemporary video games have used his aesthetic of vast landscapes and tiny heroes as direct inspiration. The legacy of Sadak remains alive because it touches a universal nerve, the feeling of being alone before something immense that overwhelms us, yet still invites us to endure. When one leaves the museum hall after contemplating the work, a feeling of inner silence remains, as if the soul too had climbed alongside the protagonist. That is John Martin's magic, transforming painting into a spiritual experience. There is no need to know the original myth or understand the technique. It is enough to be carried away by the emotion, by the echo of water and light. In that instant, we understand that Sadak, In Search of the Waters of Oblivion, is not merely a tale of Oriental fantasy, but an eternal metaphor of the human being confronting destiny. And in that confrontation, in that effort not to let go of the rock while the world roars around us, we discover what it truly means to be alive.